In this video, we're going to draw some characters from The Legend of Zelda. Now, one of the most challenging things to do when you're learning to draw is figuring out how to draw figures or anatomy, but even more challenging than that is often figuring out how to draw characters of different proportion. Large characters, small characters, skinny characters, etc. This becomes even more challenging when we add in the concepts of stylization. Sometimes those characters get larger limbs, they get smaller feet, bigger heads, whatever it may be. We still need to control this proportion and understand how to draw it properly. So in this video, what I want to do is take a few characters from Breath of the Wild, the Zora, which are the characters who have fish for heads, and the Gorons, which are the big rock characters. This is going to be a drawing lesson or a drawing demo where I take the concepts of drawing fun things like video games, comics, manga, anime, etc., and combine it with good, solid drawing concepts, principles of constructive anatomy, and a solid foundation that you might find in a book such as Drawing the Head and Hands by Andrew Loomis. The goal here is not necessarily to do fan art, it's to use these characters to better our understanding of drawing concepts and art fundamentals. The better we can draw and the more we can appreciate and understand good design, the more likely we are able to create our own interesting characters and worlds. Anyway, this should be a fun one, so let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name's Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, tools for today are a Blackwing matte pencil. I have a 2-stage sharpener that makes it a little bit longer and sharper. If I'm erasing, I'm going to be using some kneadable putty eraser. And for anatomy reference, I've got these skeletal and écorché models that are actually from anatomytools.com. And I have this art book, which is called Creating a Champion. And it's, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, Creating a Champion book. Great art book. Lots of really, really cool stuff in here. Great examples of the line and color illustration style being used for concept art and illustration and just sort of general, sort of game work, right? Which, again, it just proves to me that the style here is still very, very much a part of production and video game design. This is the same style that, was sort of used in the very, very beginning of a lot of these Zelda games. And, looking at those instruction booklets and the designs and the fantasy was a huge part of what got me interested in being an artist and wanting to create my own comics and concept art. After lots of hard work, trial and error, etc., I eventually did become a professional artist. And again, if you haven't seen a lot of my work, typically I'm drawing either comics or illustration, concept art for video games, etc. These are a couple of French books that I worked on a while ago, Pinocchio adaptation, and this is a fantasy book that I illustrated and wrote and created myself. Again, these are both sort of French books. Now, if you want to know a little bit more about how I do what I do in the line and color style, you can check out my free quick start guide. It's designed to get you up and running quickly in Photoshop, developing your own simple, reliable line and color process. It's free. The link will be in the description. And if you kind of combine a lot of the concepts that we're going to be talking about today in terms of constructive anatomy, again, you can put a lot of these pieces together and understand how I'm often creating these kind of illustrations with the drawing and then with the simple line and color process. Anyway, let's jump in to some actual drawing of Zelda characters. Alright, so first let's just go over some basic principles when it comes to blocking out and constructing characters that have very, very different sets of proportions. Now, I'm not going to necessarily focus too much on drawing these specific characters. I'm going to focus on the differences between the Zora, which are the fish aquatic characters, and the Gorons, which are these kind of bigger rocky characters. And again, so I'm not going to really try and nail any of the specific character features. I'm just going to sort of look at how we might block in and handle the initial construction. So this is how the sort of Gorons tend to look. All of the characters in Breath of the Wild tend to have shorter legs. The torso is a little bit bigger. in general. That's a sort of a stylistic affectation that you'll kind of see across the board with all these designs. Typically what we're going to see here is obviously we have this big sort of torso, muscly, sort of larger torso, still fairly small shoulders, and then these kind of big forearms. So interesting proportions, very stylized, not necessarily following along with the traditional proportions that you would see with a human character. So we have to really think about how we block this out. Now, if you compare this to the Zora character, again, we still tend to have a slightly elongated torso. So the torso is bigger, but it's not obviously as big. And it does seem that maybe even though the forearms are a little bit longer, it's not anywhere near as exaggerated. And all of the other features are very similar. What's obviously different is the size and shape of the sort of fish head designs there. So again, the goal here is really just to cover how you go about blocking in these types of different characters, not necessarily so much into the specific details of them, but these are the two sort of sheets that I'm going to use to compare. So let's start with a few really simple sketches to just understand what's going on here. So if we think about the basic proportion of a normal human, which is kind of where both all of these designs are originated, what we're going to see is a fairly simple set of proportions. And this may seem, again, if you're kind of new to this way of thinking of drawing, this may seem like, oh man, this is like a lot of technical kind of nonsense. Why do I need to do this? Once you memorize and understand a lot of these proportions that you're going to see, so in Legend of Zelda, again, we probably would have a larger head for the character in here. So I'm going to keep these cartoony, but still thinking about the typical human proportions. Once you kind of learn and understand proportion, you kind of just sublimate it, and it becomes automatic in terms of how we just put down these lines and understand how figures are built. This is why learning anatomy is useful, because once we learn it, if we apply the same concepts to stylized characters, it's very easy for us to control proportion. So if we look at sort of this as the standard, right, human. Again, this is still what I would base Link off of. How do the fish characters change that? So typically what we're going to see is here from a proportional standpoint, all right, we're going to have 1, 2 fairly standard proportional sets. We've got the legs and the upper body. And the division of that proportion is at the bottom of the pelvis. Now, if we sort of look at this character, we can see that the bottom of the pelvis is kind of here. And that's a much, much different set of proportions we've got there. So exactly kind of how much it is, it's almost like what's happening if we just kind of start, right, and sort of see these characters are, yeah, they are a little bit smaller. So I'll sort of draw them a little bit smaller for reference. I think they're a little bit small anyway. Certainly this character seems to be. So we still have the torso. Now, what we're drawing here is the rib cage. So we've got rib cage, we have the spine coming down, and the way that I sort of rationalize this is to really understand that the spine is a little bit more elongated. We're still going to have roughly the same pelvic style that you're seeing because it is basically a human character under there. We're then going to have the same shoulders, and the shoulders do seem to be, yeah, sort of fairly wide, right? Even in the sort of smaller female character, they're fairly wide. We have a long, thin neck. So the neck comes up a lot longer. So torso, basically this bit of the spine and this bit of the spine are very, very much extended in proportion versus a standard human. Now, if we look at like what this would feel like if it had normal human legs, it would kind of be like this. And you could maybe draw some kind of really cool alien style, creepy, elongated character with that sort of set of proportions. But what you kind of find is that we sort of almost have like, this is our one proportion, and then our two proportion with the Zora, right, is kind of here. And we're sort of getting, bonk, we're sort of getting something like this almost. And that's really what is kind of happening. Bonk, bonk. And obviously there's, right, fish head there. So that's kind of what's happening there. Now, if we look, and obviously this is very rough, right? So we're not really trying to match, again, the specific design there. If we look at the other characters, the rock guys, the Gorons, what we have there is, again, it's a similar idea, but just the torso is a lot more expanded. So, again, this would be a much larger character physically, but we're still going to think about, like, look, how big is that top proportion versus the legs? And it seems to be quite a bit. In most of those designs, we're looking at something that feels more like, look, here's the torso and here's the legs. And the character really kind of comes down at the bottom. So I still always try and think about this from the perspective of there being some type of skeleton under there, and what does that look like? So often in that case, I've still got and again, I'm not necessarily trying to match this proportion exactly. I'm just sort of roughing this in and now sort of trying to construct what I sort of see there. So we can still think about, like, yeah, maybe there is this rib cagey thing. And behind the back, right, I'm going to draw and get that spine working there. Now, it's sort of tricky to understand exactly what's happening in terms of how long that spine is there, but I feel like, again, it's what we sort of see is pretty rough. And then, again, we're still seeing pelvis that's pretty wide. And these little legs, right? They're pretty far apart. Right? And the feet are pretty small. What we have up here, though, is if we look at the character from the side, you can see that the head is attaching much more forward. So if we were to look at that where the head would be attaching, essentially the torso is kind of rotated around a little bit. So if we were to view this from the side, which you can kind of see there, the torso in my mind is sort of like twisted a little bit. The character's a little bit hunched, or at least that's how I read that proportion, but not too much. So we've got the spine coming around here, and the head is kind of sitting on top here. And there's not a huge separation between where the head and the torso meet, i.e. the neck is almost non-existent. So we're seeing something a little bit more like that. Now, if we draw this line, which I often use to represent the character's shoulders, right? Again, I don't have to put in all the musculature yet. Mostly what I'm interested in is proportion. And what we have there is these pretty small, relatively speaking, shoulders. So the shoulders are still pretty small. And if we look at the arm that's kind of under there, you can see that sort of upper arm is pretty short. The bottom arm is a lot longer. And again, it pretty much kind of comes down to just above the knee. So if we think about here, we've got our giant fists. Here we've got our giant forearms. Again, I'm just being super simple. And here we've got our sort of upper arm. This is kind of what we've got. And again, what we're kind of seeing is these hands are huge. Now, it's important to just go through and do this type of work to really understand what's happening with the character, because again, there's going to be my understanding of what I think is happening with the character, but then when I go in there, I'm like, oh man, yeah, those hands are like way bigger than I thought. This is bigger than I thought. And you really start to understand what makes this type of character tick. But this is going to give you a pretty good idea of how I would kind of break down the mannequin, right? The underlying simple skeletal structure that you're going to see there. And once I kind of understand that, then it's a lot easier to pose, because now I can just move some of these limbs around and I kind of understand how big they should be. I understand all of this stuff. Now, obviously, there's a huge stomach there. That is going to be a major part of the final design. But we don't necessarily need to put those things on until after, because these bits of fleshy design are going to move around, whereas the skeletal structure is not. So yeah, and then a big part of what we're going to see is obviously some hair, right? We're going to have beard that is going to make a big part of the character, and then there's often rocks on the character's back. So there's all these different elements that are going to make up the character, but this is kind of how I would start to break it down in the beginning and just start to understand the proportion. All right, so let's just see if we can draw some of these characters out, and I'll repeat this general theory, right? So you'll see this idea repeated again. This is kind of the little cheat sheet, so you know where I'm going. But what we're trying to do is just draw these characters and talk about these different ideas, and also I'll work a little bit more on the secondary form. How do we handle the beard, all these other sort of little bits and pieces? Because again, I think that stuff is interesting. So you can see, again, I've got a little reference here that I'm using, but I can also see some of the other stuff there. Now, I'm going to draw these characters not necessarily to scale. So I'm going to try and obviously draw the bigger character to be bigger. And we're just going to deal with standard character design style, drawing poses. So again, often good initially to kind of rough in what's happening. And I think that my process often has a couple of phases like this. One is to really try and figure out, now that I have the manic, now that I understand that, I can actually start to plan those initial basic shapes and be a little bit looser with how I plan it out. And what I'll do after that is drill down and try and add a construction pass. And this is typically how I work. And the more we understand the design sort of construction, the more we understand how this works, the easier and more accurate these initial rough sketches become. So in the beginning, what I will sort of find if I'm just learning a character design like this is that these first sketches are pretty rough, and I have to do a lot of that construction work after to really true it up. And that's probably also the case for me if I am, when I was starting out, right? I had to do a lot more, of this basic construction stuff and really true up the drawing, make sure it didn't, look off, look weird. As I progress and as I know the characters in my own books and my own designs, we find that this gets pretty close. All right, so let's have a go here. Now, I'll also try maybe draw this character with one of those sort of swords or something like that, because that also might give us a good indication of how to handle some of this stuff. It means we won't draw the feet, but it'll also give us a bit of extra drawing lesson material. So this is kind of what I'm thinking about. We got these arms, and then this character has got. So let's try and make this sword, right, come at us a little bit more so that we can see this hand a bit more. And I feel like this hand should be up a bit more too. Boom. So again, just trying to feel out the space. And all I'm doing is kind of drawing these spherical bowl shapes, right? That's all that we're doing. And it's just to mass it out, just to be like, well, look, where is everything likely to be? So we're also going to have, obviously, some serious pectoral muscles here. And obviously again, we're also going to have a fairly large kind of stomach, although, again, some of these characters are pretty sort of buff. The idea is they're super strong. All right. So, again, that's giving us a rough idea of what's happening with these legs. Now, the other principle of a constructive anatomy that we need to use here is the concept of drawing through. So if I draw through, it means that even though maybe I know there's going to be a sword or something here, I can draw through and make sure that, all of these other bits that are behind the elements in front are still drawn, and so I kind of can put them in. Now, I'm probably just going to keep this sword basic. I'm not going to try and match the reference too much because mostly it'll just take up some time, but we can block it in by thinking about it as a simple kind of geometric form. And if we block it in there and we understand where it's going, that means if I did need to add detail, I'd have a pretty good approximation and understanding for how to, build extra form and structure off there. Right, again, we just kind of hack bits off and start to build it. So again, just a very, very basic sort of rough in there. Now, let's think about what's happening with the anatomy of the face. So we can see here, again, these designs are actually giving us a really good indication of some of that stuff. We can see it here again, the hair and how these proportional elements are kind of working. What I can kind of see is that the facial proportion has the nose kind of here and fairly kind of wide set relative to everything else eyes. And we have this nose. It's kind of looking something like that. And then there is a massive amount of lips. Now, I'm going to try and again use all of the same principles that I normally would if I was constructing human features. So I'm going to think about, again, where is the mound of the mouth? Where are the cheekbones? Even though a lot of these things might not be there. But this is how I will honestly break down anything like this. And this is why, again, learning anatomy and having a good appreciation for that stuff will always be useful. So we've got top lip there. And we've got kind of bottom lip here. Boom. And then we've obviously got some teeth. So you can kind of see, again, that's kind of roughly working, roughly in the right position. We're going to have some eyebrows here. So what I'm doing is blocking in from a constructive anatomy point of view all these features. And this is going to allow me to visualize and understand the character in 3 dimensions. Now, obviously, there are additional character design bits that are going to be really important that we can put in here, like these bits of the beard, etc. And I'm just sort of roughing in the rough position of those things right now. And do they have ears that you can see? Kind of. Feels like the ears are often sort of hidden. Boom. And then there's hair going down the back as well. And potentially there's going to be some of these sort of rocks on the back as well. So again, that's looks very artificial, but this is what is going to get us started. All right. So then again, we're going to have pectorals. I've got my center line for the stomach. right? I understand where the shoulders are going to be relative to everything else. I can imagine there would be clavicle, right? So if we look at our anatomical sort of base, what I'm trying to understand is where that clavicle is, how it connects to the arm. If I can find an arm here somewhere. Here we go. So we got our arm in here. And yeah, what I'm trying to find is these forms. Now I have on the channel plenty of additional videos that talk about constructing some of all of those elements, by themselves. So I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail here. But what you'll find is I'm using all of exactly the same bits and pieces. Got our mass of the shoulder. I've got the bicep, which is going to connect up underneath that deltoid. Sorry, not sure whether I called this a deltoid before. But yes, deltoid, bicep, tricep, giant forearm. And here you can see, again, like the absurdity of the design proportion. And if you are designing video games, often the extent you need to go to create shapes that are really going to read nicely in a game, such as Breath of the Wild. In order to get that sort of really epic feeling that feels stylized, we often need to go pretty far. Can't get this stuff done just by, pushing things a little bit. They've often got to get really, really epic. Boom. All right, so you can see how I'm starting to build these ideas. Here we're going to have, again, this gigantic fist. And again, just trying to find those primary forms. Getting all the details here will be its own challenge, like really understanding, and drawing this out. Again, if you want me to do some additional sort of demos there, I can really sort of dig into it. But mostly what I want to focus on is just the comparative anatomy, how we handle this compared to the Zora. So I'm just doing plenty of drawing through so you can see how we're finding those proportions. Right, let's make sure we still find center, get some dimensionality to these different elements of the design. Because that's what will help us shade it, if we need to add shadows, etc. Boom. Another one over there. And typically, yeah, it's important to understand which of these lines do we need for our finished design. Which ones can we get rid of? Which design elements of this nose really make it feel as if, like, oh yeah, it is one of those characters, right? So obviously if we look at the shape here, once I've blocked it in and I have it roughly in the right position, it's a lot easier then to go in and get it looking more on model in terms of shape design. Boom. So yeah, and again, it's just a matter of progressing with this idea, drawing all of the other additional bits and pieces. But we have everything roughly in the right position. Although I do think, again, that the pectorals do seem to be a little bit kind of smaller, right? They're sort of quite compact compared to everything else. Which again is just another little fun stylistic quirk of, how that design style functions. We've got these very sort of compressed pectoral muscles, which again, you will find on a lot of anatomical, humans, as people have got very divergent anatomy in that regard. And we're going to have our sort of six-pack that kind of really is not visible beyond that sort of first mark. Boom. And we're seeing a lot of these muscles here. Boom. Again, got the knee, and for here, heel, ball of the foot. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right, so just behind there, we'll see that. So you get the idea. Anyway, as I keep saying, can't go into heaps of detail in terms of nutting out all of those secondary forms. I do have other demos where I, go into that sort of detail. But again, hopefully that gives you an idea of how we would construct and build out the primary forms for a character like this. So let's take that idea to the next stage and see if we can look at how we would do the Zora. As I said, just to refresh, the basic difference here is the character is obviously a lot smaller. They have an elongated neck that's quite upright, and elongated torso, which I feel is mostly represented by a more elongated spine. So, if we look at the proportion here, right, it's this bit that's getting longer and this bit that's getting longer. So that's sort of what I'm going to try here, is see if we can get this over here so it's still visible. Move this a little bit, and we'll try and block in a Zora character. And I'll see how far I can sort of take them to a finish. Now, again, I'll make this character a little bit smaller so we can see how that might work. But again, I'm not trying to get the proportion exactly right or anything. If you remember from the proportion here, kind of sneak that under there so we can see it. What we're dealing with is, again, something I'm just doing by eye, but something that seems a little bit more like this, where here we're going to have the pelvis, longer spine. We're still going to have our rib cage kind of here, pretty small. Right, and again, if you look at how those legs are, there is quite a bit of curvature, right? We sort of see quite a bit of that thigh. All right, so longer torso, rib cage, and much longer neck as well. Now again, how long is the neck? Oh, maybe it's not that long. Hard to say, but I have drawn it before and gotten it when I was doing some Zora face studies. I have gotten it a little bit wrong. These things are often longer and more exaggerated than we might imagine. So again, I'm just going to draw something similar to this character, which is more of a sort of character in the game. So not super wide shoulders. Some of the male Zora characters have much sort of wider shoulders. And I'm going to go with a similar proportional measurement to what you would see on the human, which is where the elbow comes down to the bottom of the rib cage. And then if we look at where the hand comes down to, the hand comes down to just about here. So we're looking at a proportional set like that, or something like that. And again, let's play around with the pose a little bit so it's a tiny bit more interesting. Let's maybe put this arm up. And this will just sort of illustrate how, right, I'm thinking about how long is that? Yeah, about that long. This gives us a good indication of how we might use these ideas to draw different posed characters. So again, just looks like a silly skeleton at the moment. What we need to do is add that secondary form. To start doing that, I'm going to roughly add some masses in the form of just spheres to block in where I think this extra form needs to go. Now, this character is not hugely muscled, and if we didn't have a lot of these other really interesting shapes, probably would be a little bit of a, you know, a boring design, but we have a lot of these extra design shapes. So what we have is, as I would construct this, we kind of have a head under there. Boom, boom. And then instead of the nose, if we think about, here's where we would have a normal nose for the head. Here's where we'd have normal eyes for the head. Instead of that, what we find is that the nose becomes the front of this fish thing. And it actually comes up pretty high. And as you can see towards the back here, it's actually kind of coming out, and like the back of the fish is almost as big as the head here. So I'm thinking about dimensionality. So if we were to think about this from a primary form standpoint, we've got a sphere for the head, and off the back of it, we kind of have a cone or a tapering cylinder. And that's all we're dealing with, really. Now, the more we study our principles, our foundational concepts, the easier this stuff becomes. So this comes down pretty far, actually. About to sort of here, down near her back. And what we can see is, again, if I try and block in the shape of this fish here, again, it feels less like a shark. It looks a little bit more like a whale, right? It's got that kind of less aggressive look. These bits at the side do seem to hook up, but let's just think about the basic proportion of where these were if we were to consider them as like, right, just as big old triangles, right? So thinking about it like this a bit more. Let's start with that as a breakdown. So that's giving us the initial thing. Next, what I want to do, once I sort of have that sorted, I'm like, okay, let's look at what other things we've got. We've got these shoulder patty fin things here. We have this nice kind of, tapered torso that's going down here. We have this weird fish fin thing that comes out. Boom. Got a hand here. We can obviously erase this at this point. Got torso tapering down. And then we have some of these other forms. Right, so we've got this. Again, weird design, but it kind of works, right? And this is why, again, even though I'm not a huge fan of, doing fan art and, spending lots of time doing that personally, I mean, if that's what you want to do, then that's totally fine, like whatever you enjoy drawing. But again, it's often understanding like how far you need to push stuff that will give you an appreciation for, how designers who have been, doing this for a long time are operating, right? And if you are interested in more stylized work, it can often be a real challenge to figure out how to design your own designs. And a big part of that comes from, in my experience, yeah, just kind of looking at these things and understanding like how far do we need to push it. So you can see here again, it feels like this torso is even less wide here. So we got this arm connecting up here. And again, I'm not going over and breaking down all of the other anatomical bits and pieces because, as I keep saying, most of this is about proportion. So let's look at how we might solve, again, just a few more details here. But hopefully you can see that, again, you know, we've got the basics working here. Now, one of the things that, again, I feel like we can alter and you might have to keep learning is, yeah, exactly where do some of these other forms start and stop? Right? How do we get all of those little details working? If you get the whole proportion roughly right, though, all of those other bits and pieces will kind of fall into place. All right, so we've got these little legs here. Let's see if we can block those in. They're fairly chunky. Got some knees. And let's think about what's happening with these feet. Got some feet here. Drawing the heel and then the ball of the foot. We've got one toe. Right, that seems to be really big. And then we've got some other ones on the side there. Again, very simple. This is just a little kind of proportional sketch, so I'm not going to go in there and draw all the toes. Now again, I would imagine we're going to see some lats at the back there, although often what you'll find is these designs really are designed to work well without a lot of muscle deformation, because that's often not super possible with, especially, you know, with the sort of more dated graphical abilities of the Nintendo consoles at the moment. They're still not at the point where, again, you can have all the deformation of all the muscles. So what that means is you tend to find like limbs being quite separated. So we don't put a lot of deformation in the joints, even though that's where you often would see a lot of deformation. And that's just technical limitation of design. That's probably why, again, you see a lot of the real segmentation of the larger kind of Goron characters, where you have these kind of spherical shoulders. A lot of those deformation points are kind of covered up, and that's just so it kind of looks good when we don't see all the muscles kind of deform quite as much as you might see in, like, for instance, the latest like Street Fighter 6. If you've seen the graphics for that, you can see they really have a lot of that muscle deformation happening there. You know, it's pretty good. All right, so what else do we have here? Let's see if we can draw in, all right, some of these extra details here. So we've got this fishy wing here. We've got one, right? This kind of lines up with the eye. And I'll do a bit of a raising pass and we'll see if we can clean this up. And then we've got this comes down here, and it's kind of giving us this sort of look here. Boom, boom, boom. Transfer that over. Boom, transfer that over. There we go. Now, in terms of the mouth, that's going to be pretty much where it would normally be. Around about there. And we've got some sort of manga-ish eyes. All right. So yeah, hopefully this is giving you an idea for how we would sort of block this in. Okay, so again, only thing left is, again, thinking about some sort of hands, which I'm just going to rough in there. But yeah, so there you go. Again, basic set of proportions for both characters. Now, again, not 100% accurate to the model sheets or anything like that, but we get the general idea. All right, so lastly, what I want to do is just quickly go through and see if we can clean these up a bit, right? I'm going to still focus on primary form. We're not going to go crazy with adding costume details, just going to stick to the anatomical markers. But again, let's see if we can clean these up and clarify some of those details a little bit once we've gotten everything kind of drawn in there. Also, again, not going to be dealing too much with hands or other bits and pieces. Again, if it's funny with drawing, often just adding that extra little bit of detail will take another, sort of hour or so, right? So to really go through and put all the detail that we want on here will be quite a bit of time indeed. All right. But yeah, let's have a go, right? Let's get more of this off. I think this kneadable eraser is probably at the end of its life. It's not really. It's saying I'm already full of lead. I got nothing. And typically when I'm erasing, again, I'm looking for stuff that's like working, right? If it's working, I'm like, let's leave it. If it's not working, or if there's a whole bunch of sort of junk there, I'm like, let's take it back. Does this feel like its own character? Are there a huge amount of sketchy lines there? Just all of those bits and pieces. I feel like there's a lot of, like what is going to sort of go in there and affect the character. Right. So I've got again, the way I rationalize this is instead of a nose, we have a fish head. It comes up, kind of becomes the top of the eye. We still are going to have lips, and these are, again, just going to be drawn in super small. And obviously, if we were to add some shading, it would be shaded under there, because that is really going to separate out that form. This comes out here. Can get rid of that. But we do have quite a distinct mark there. So again, not the best line quality. Will suffice. And again, we've still got our normal human anatomical markers here. Like the clavicle. With a bit of shading there, right? Again, under the neck. Probably going to see some of that. Again, see if we can separate that form out to help us understand what's going on. Right, same thing here. Boom. And here we've got this weird fish fin thing that comes out of the arm. And again, these are just things so that, from my understanding, right, again, my breakdown of the character design is these are things which help the character to feel like a fish, to feel aquatic. They don't necessarily make any sense from a logical point of view. Like, why would there be a fin there? But it kind of looks cool, and it takes, again, what is maybe an interesting silhouette, but might feel also a little bit awkward. It kind of takes that idea and makes it into something that, again, like has a lot more uniqueness. And it's often these things when you're dealing with that, that more stylized look that we have to lean into from a design perspective. And this is one of those things, I mean, when I started doing design for video games, And, typically when people hire me, they kind of hire me to do the type of design that you would see in Breath of the Wild, because that's often pretty similar to my style. So I've worked on a number of projects that kind of have a, similar stylized look. If you don't add this level of exaggeration, and then your design actually does get designed and made into something, it just doesn't look like anything, right? You kind of really do need that level of exaggeration that's kind of a bit silly, and I think it often takes a really good mix of a designer to be able to come up with plausible ideas there that kind of make sense, fun shapes, fun designs, so that it's clear to everyone that, this is a fish, right? We're getting all of those, cool cues. So again, we could also lean into maybe adding a bit of tonality for the fish, because we've got this two-tone design which is so integral to the character. Right, you could play around with adding that if you wanted. Boom. But yeah, really just very cool, simple designs. Big fishy toe with webbed, smaller, extra feet there. Now, you do see this back kind of fin there sometimes. But yeah, that's mostly what we're dealing with. So yeah, that's kind of how I'd sort of plus that one. Again, just a little bit of extra time. Let's have a go here, see if we can put a little bit of extra sauce on this guy. Again, same general idea. Just going to try and define these bits and pieces. So we've got our sort of fist here. The way I'm going to try and break that down is to think about, again, the general kind of wedge of the hand here. Right, I'm going to have the thumb here. And yeah, just dealing with super basic construction. So I've sort of got like one top finger there, and we've got this one, and then I'm kind of imagining we're not really going to see the other ones there as much, right? Although those other fingers will be there behind. And again, this is another one of those things where I probably have to spend a little bit of time really understanding the character and exactly how they're constructed, like how we sort of get the hands working. There's often a lot of little tricks that kind of happen, but this is the basic sort of construction that I would be working with. And again, the fingernails seem to be very claw-like. So again, that's not necessarily the best drawing of a hand, but should give us some indication of what's going on. And what you'll notice is often where we have these proportional things that might not make sense, i.e., it's a little bit harder to rationalize how like a big hand goes into a big forehand or whatever. We often do have these bracelets that break down the design, and again, make it a lot easier to understand and maybe rig the character from a three-dimensional point of view. So we might have, again, similar here, these big bracelets. All right. And again, they have, sort of pretty, they also have some structure, which we would just bring out. Oh. Again, being super rough. So those elements definitely need another pass. But this is how we would build out all those little bits and pieces of costume, right? Just add extra bits. Hands get bigger. Put in some knuckles. See if we can get them looking epic. Again, we've got these cool bits of rocky fur coming out of here, which also will, you know, from a design sort of construction, like what will work in game, these will probably help take our mind a little bit away from how that deformation works. Boom. We've also got some hair on top of the shoulder. So I'm just working on shape here. Not really trying to think too much about the form. And we can see that likewise the beard here is gonna come down on some of these characters anyway. Like they're all different, but you can kind of see how that's working, and that's sort of covering up some of those details as well. Yeah, again, always good to understand, right, like where the structure is for all of these. So you don't necessarily have to draw it in all the time, but understanding roughly where the top and bottom of these forms will be, right, where the shadows might be that they are going to fall, that's going to fall from those forms. This is what will allow you to, you know, properly just modify that. Yeah, properly go in there and actually render it if that's what you want to do. So we've got some big teeth at the front, got these big lips. Shade them in. If that'll help us. And again, let's put these nostrils in again because I feel like they really kind of helped. Boom. Again, we've got a pretty distinct hairline up top. So with all of these forms, again, try and find out or think about where the shadow is. You don't always have to draw it in. You just need to understand where it is, right, for your own uses. Boom. And again, if I was doing this in the line and color style, like, you know, if you've seen my sort of work or any of that, you know, I don't draw this way. I don't add shading to the drawings. I try and keep everything very clean line. I'm doing this merely to demonstrate that often adding in this form is something that happens mentally, and the more we understand it, the better we're able to draw the form. That is to say, the better I understand, you know, maybe that there is sort of a shadow side to some of these bits of hair, the easier it is for me to actually draw just the clean line. So I might just draw, right, like this shape, and I might just do it flat. I might not have any shading, but me understanding where those shadows might go, if I do need to put them in, helps me to actually draw the shape better and focus on the shape design. If that makes any sense. Similarly here, right? And this is where there's a big difference between the, you know, our like the style. A style is not necessarily easier or simpler, right? Like often people who are working in very exaggerated, simple styles could render this stuff if they needed to. It's a matter of sort of figuring out and understanding what is needed for the particular project. So over here again, because I know and I've drawn through, I know that there's a foot over there, isn't there? And I've got some toes. I can draw those in, or at least have a go. It's not going to look super weird with no foot over there. Though again, might come down a little bit further. And yeah, that's kind of what I would do. I mean, I feel like what I'd want to do is have another pass on this, right? On this thing. I feel like that was pretty rough, as is this. But all we're doing is just really thinking about concentric circles. Right, so I've got a cylinder here. Right, once you have the proportion locked, it's just a matter of going in and doing this type of work with a whole bunch of different little elements. So there would be the bracelet. Now, all that we're doing is essentially thinking about another concentric circle around there that we add extra dimension to. And all of these lines are going to radiate from more or less the center, which is probably important also to put in. But yeah, that's all that's kind of happening there, right? We're just putting boom. These forms there, and then as you can see, they're obviously not as big. All right, so we're making them smaller, and then we will make them smaller this way as well. So that's the general idea. Let's see if we can get that happening. Because these things are, and the other thing is these things are huge, right? But yes, so here we have our details there. Boom. Constructing that, and let's construct one. Again, refine how that's looking. And then we've got another one over here. Boom. And then we've got another one. So I'm sort of tracing, I'm trying to find that imaginary bit. Comes out there. Boom. Comes out there. Boom. And that's going to give me like a pretty good rough version of that. And again, probably all we do is do the same thing on here, but I'll leave this pretty basic so we don't have to go through and spend another 10 minutes on all that stuff. Because again, this is what happens if you sort of start a drawing and then it's like, oh, okay, now I need to add more detail. And the other thing to understand again is that, we often need to, when we're going in and, really starting to refine all this detail, like, oh, okay, where are the knuckles? What's happening? All right, this is where, again, you need some reference. You need to really think about, looking at your own hand reference, how that kind of works. And how that interacts with the stylized version of the character. What can you get away with? And boom. So think about drawing through. Let's put a bit of rough shadow on that, and we'll call it a day. Otherwise, again, I'll get sort of stuck redrawing that a million times, which would be fun, but not the point of this particular exercise. So again, a couple of things again, we could sort of, improve is just trying to position this hand. Again, I'm not entirely sure, where that sort of hand would be best positioned. And these are the things that you refine as you're doing more fan art or designing your own characters, is kind of understanding like, where would the character's hands be? Like, where do they fit? Where do they not fit? What looks good? What creates interesting designs? What, sort of makes the character feel as if they are the right type of character? You refine those things, you understand the proportions better, you become better able to pose them. And again, eventually you can kind of redraw them multiple times and kind of really sort of dial all these things in. But for now, again, let me know in the comments how this one sort of goes and whether this kind of idea is helpful. But again, I just wanted to really dig into the idea of how you draw vastly different types of characters and how we use fundamental principles, constructive anatomy, etc. to help us do that. Anyway, that's all I got for this one. We'll catch you around. Happy drawing.